June 1941. German troops advancing into the Soviet Union encountered a tank they couldn't stop. Their standard 37mm anti-tank guns bounced shells off its armor like rocks off a brick wall. Soldiers called those guns door knockers because all they did was announce your presence before the T-34 crushed you. One T-34 took over 30 direct hits, destroyed 2 German panzers, and drove back to Soviet lines. The Germans were terrified. But here's what nobody talks about. This revolutionary tank that shocked the Wehrmacht became a death trap for its own crews. 44,900 T-34s were destroyed during World War II. That's more tank losses than any nation in history. The crews knew they were climbing into coffins, and they did it anyway. Operation Barbarossa was supposed to be Germany's easy victory. Soviet equipment was considered inferior. German panzer commanders expected to sweep through Russian forces in weeks. Then they met the T-34. A German column encountered one near the border and opened fire with their 37mm guns. The shells sparked off the sloped armor and did nothing. The T-34 pivoted, crushed the anti-tank gun under its treads, and destroyed 2 Panzer IIs before disappearing. Another T-34 was hit over 30 times by various German weapons during a single engagement. It kept fighting, eliminated multiple targets, and withdrew when the crew decided they'd done enough damage. German General Paul von Kleist called it the finest tank in the world. The sloped armor was revolutionary. German tanks still used vertical plates that were easier to penetrate. The initial terror German troops felt was absolutely real. Inside that invincible tank was a nightmare. Early T-34s had a single turret hatch that Soviet crews nicknamed the pirozhok, stuffed bun, because it was heavy, awkward, and extremely difficult to open under stress. When a T-34 was hit and caught fire, crews had seconds to escape before ammunition cooked off or fuel ignited. Many couldn't get out. They burned alive inside while frantically trying to force that hatch open. The interior was so cramped that American engineers who examined captured T-34s couldn't believe 4 men were expected to operate inside wearing winter gear. There was no turret basket. The crew stood on ammunition boxes stored in the hull. One wrong step could detonate the rounds beneath your feet. The armor that made the T-34 revolutionary also killed its crews in ways German tankers didn't experience. Soviet armor was hard and brittle. When German shells hit without penetrating, the impact still sent metal fragments spalling off the interior surfaces. These razor-sharp shards of steel tore through anyone inside. A Korean War study of T-34s found that when the armor was penetrated, 75% of the crew became casualties. Compare that to 18% for American Shermans. The overall crew fatality rate for T-34s was 28% when destroyed, versus 24.6% for Shermans. The T-34's armor protected against penetration better than most tanks. But when anything got through, or even just hit hard enough, everyone inside was in serious danger. The commander was also the gunner. Think about that. One man had to spot targets, identify them, give orders to the driver, aim the gun, and fire, all simultaneously. It was impossible. German tanks had dedicated commanders with cupolas that let them observe the battlefield. T-34 commanders had one forward-facing periscope until 1943 models added a cupola. They fought blind. German gunners regularly got off 2 or 3 accurate shots before T-34 crews could even respond, because the Soviet commander was too busy doing 3 jobs at once. One engagement report described a German anti-tank gun firing 23 rounds into a T-34, jamming its turret ring, before the Soviet crew even noticed they were under attack. The crews were fighting with their heads down, unable to see what was happening around them. 44,900 T-34s destroyed. Let that sink in. In 1941 alone, the Soviets lost 2,300 T-34s in 6 months. In 1942, another 6,600 were destroyed. The loss ratio during 1941-1942 was 4 to 7 Soviet tanks for every German tank knocked out. 40% of T-34 losses weren't even from combat. They broke down. The average T-34 needed major repairs after just 125 miles. Gearboxes failed constantly, transmissions gave out, engines overheated, crews abandoned perfectly good tanks because they couldn't fix them in the field. The production quality was so poor that brand new tanks sometimes didn't make it from the factory to the front line. But the Soviets kept building them because they could replace losses faster than Germany could destroy them. Most T-34s didn't have radios until 1944. Read that again. The majority of Soviet tanks went into battle unable to communicate with each other. Only platoon leaders had radios, 1 tank in 5. The rest of the crews were supposed to follow orders by watching signal flags waved from the leader's tank during combat. Try doing that in the smoke, dust, and chaos of a tank battle. It was impossible. Soviet attacks routinely dissolved into chaos because individual tanks couldn't coordinate. Every crew fought alone, making their own decisions, with no way to call for help or warn others about threats. German tankers exploited this ruthlessly, picking off isolated T-34s that didn't know their neighbors had been destroyed. Escaping a burning T-34 was nearly impossible by design. The emergency bottom hatch required loosening 6 hex nuts and removing 6 bolt bars while fire and smoke filled the crew compartment. Even if you managed that, the hatches frequently jammed from shell impact deformation. Winter clothing made Soviet tankers too bulky to fit through the hatches quickly. Some crews wedged their hatches partially open with leather straps, sacrificing protection for a chance at survival. The fuel cells were mounted in the hull sides where they were vulnerable to any penetrating hit. When those ruptured, the tank became an instant inferno. German tankers reported seeing T-34 crews frantically beating on jammed hatches from inside while their tanks burned. The crews knew this design would kill them, and they climbed in anyway because the motherland demanded it. So why did the T-34 win? Numbers. The Soviets built over 80,000 of them. They were simple to manufacture, cheap to produce, and fast to train crews on. German tanks were better designed, better built, and better equipped. But Germany couldn't replace losses. The Soviets could afford to lose 7 tanks for every German tank destroyed because they had 7 tanks to lose. German forces found themselves outnumbered 3 to 1, 5 to 1, sometimes 10 to 1. Quality doesn't matter when quantity reaches a certain threshold. Soviet tankers weren't stupid. They knew the T-34's flaws intimately. They knew the hatches would jam. They knew they'd fight blind. They knew one penetrating hit would probably kill everyone inside. They climbed in anyway and drove toward German lines because someone had to, and there was always another T-34 behind them. The T-34 was simultaneously the best tank and the worst tank of World War II. It shocked German forces in 1941 with armor and firepower they couldn't match. It killed its own crews throughout the entire war, with design flaws that were never properly fixed. Soviet victory on the Eastern Front was built on mountains of destroyed T-34s and the bodies of tankers who knew they were driving coffins. The Germans learned to exploit every weakness, the blind spots, the communication failures, the cramped interiors, the terrible escape hatches. But it didn't matter. For every T-34 they destroyed, 2 more appeared. The war was won by men willing to die in greater numbers than the enemy could kill them. The T-34 didn't win because it was a great tank. It won because Soviet crews had the courage to keep climbing into a death trap, even when they knew the odds. Sometimes victory isn't about having the best equipment. It's about being willing to sacrifice everything, and the T-34 crews sacrificed everything.